no stage was there some secret plan by me or the MOJ to aim to release thousands of prisoners. It was something that we were very resistant to, and the events were borne out, I think, by my version of events and the work that was done by PHE, Public Health England, and by officials in my department.
Is it frustrating to read diaries of your colleagues, some of whom, obviously, I mean, clearly, like Matt Hancock, is still in Parliament, although not for much longer, when they are suggesting things that you believe not to be true?
Yeah. Well, they're not diaries, are they? They're not contemporaneous notes, as I understand it. They're recollections that were written up by another writer well after the events. And there's always, I think, a risk with that. Look, we've got a big public inquiry started. I mean, Lady Hallett, a very experienced appeal judge, is running a major public inquiry. And I think all of us who had responsibility for major parts of public service during COVID should actually hang on and wait for that inquiry to take place. That inquiry will involve not just politicians and civil servants, but members of society, bereaved families, other interested parties who were very grievously affected by what happened. And I think we should give that inquiry the time and the respect that it deserves to make its inquiries and then make its findings. And I think it's far better to for people like me to respect that process and let that take its course before publishing or writing or disclosing recollections that we may have had about the events at the time. British government is facing enormous headwinds, and I know that is often used as a byline for ministers to be perceived to somehow pass the buck, but that's the reality. The unwind from COVID was bound to have had long-term effects upon the cost of things, and we've seen that in terms of the supply of items that has helped lead to a rise in inflation across the world, and now, of course, fueled by the energy crisis as well. And therefore, for any government in office at the moment, it's a huge challenge. But I think it's a little unfair, to say the least, that somehow the government doesn't have, the luxury of choice. Its majority is still a significant one, and I think the survival instinct of Conservative MPs, if nothing less, will increasingly kick in, and that sort of unite or die message that I think has been well articulated by Rishi and others is understood by all colleagues who want to carry on. And that is going to be the vast majority of colleagues. I think a lot and probably too much has been made of retirements. The numbers aren't actually stratospherically high. They're not unusual, I think, in terms of this point in the Parliament. I'm sure we'll see more. We'll see a few more on the Labour side as well. I think politics has become this much more shorter term role than it used to be, and churn is higher. But coming back to the main issue, I think the government's got a handle on the key issues. I think we're seeing steadying of the economy with regard to Jeremy Hunt's announcements in the autumn, difficult though they were, a strengthening of the pound, and all the signs of a sensible Conservative government that is stewarding the economy through difficult times. I think the public want honesty and want straightforwardness. They don't want false hope and false optimism. And perhaps Rishi is to be forgiven if at times he sounds a little bit too straightforward with the public about the gravity of the situation that we face.
Well, let's pick up on one of those points, because you are here to join us in the confessional on this Sunday afternoon to talk about your highs and lows in politics. And something you mentioned there struck me. You said politics has become a bit more short term. Essentially, people's careers are not as lengthy as they used to be. But you have had a pretty significant and lengthy career so far in Parliament. I mean, do you think it's a shame that we're starting to lose MPs after just a few years now?
I do. I think it's a huge shame because with longevity comes experience and institutional memory, and an understanding that, however well intentioned, a civil servant bringing you an old policy that has been dusted down from the shelf might be, there's usually a reason why that policy has not been advanced before. I mean, that's just one example of how politicians with experience can lend an air of legitimate scrutiny to the process, whether it's as a backbencher in Parliament, select committee member or chair, or indeed as a returning minister who knows the score. And I do think that whilst energy and that sort of the need to have huge resources of energy in modern politics can't be underestimated. And I think that's what perhaps drives some people out of politics in the end, is that they just run out of steam. I do think that that sort of long-term memory and knowledge is essential, and a parliament that is full of novices, is going to not be the scrutinising body that we need it to be, frankly. The early part of the COVID crisis, where Public Health England presented some pretty stark estimates and projections about the potential effect of COVID in prisons in terms of disease and indeed death, was an extremely stark and sobering moment for everybody involved, most notably me. And in order to deal with those projections, we had to come up with plans to make sure that COVID did not spread through the estate in a way that not only would have caused illness to staff and to inmates, but also disorder potentially, as panic or fear would have spread without proper communication. And actually, looking back, I'm relieved and rather proud that everybody pulled together and the staff worked incredibly well to minimise the spread of COVID in prisons. That did mean lockdowns of quite a draconian nature, but then the rest of society was being locked down. And that was really the message that I think prisoners understood as we spread it out. But, we were facing at one stage with a projection of many, many thousands of deaths, and a suggestion from some quarters that we should, as other countries like the US did, release thousands of prisoners into the community. You can imagine the dusty response that got from me and others, and the attempts that we made, indeed the successful attempts that we made to manage COVID without the need to release thousands and thousands of prisoners, apart from a few who were ill and who were at the end of their lives. And indeed, some prisoners we released on a tagging system, which was very few indeed, only a few hundred, and which were successfully monitored in the community. So I'm looking back, it was a moment of fear, a moment of real worry, but also looking back, a moment of relief and pride that we got through the epidemic without those mass releases that I think would have caused real public concern.
Were there people who were telling you at the time that you were making the wrong decision?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, there were a lot of voices saying to me that what I should be doing was releasing prisoners. There was even a threat of legal action at one time from some organisations who work with prisoners and deal with the issue of standards and safety in prisons. Legal action is never something you want, particularly on an issue as sensitive as this. But I'm glad that we struck absolutely the right balance. And I suppose the issue sort of was thrown into further relief by Matt Hancock's diaries the other week. I have a very clear recollection that at all times I was aiming to contain the outbreak in prisons without the need to release prisoners. I think that was certainly the Prime Minister's view as well. And it was work that I and my officials did with Public Health England directly that avoided the sort of problems that we saw in other sectors, say care homes, happening in prisons. And lessons had really been learned well. And we managed to quarantine and segregate people who were either symptomatic or who were vulnerable to illnesses such as COVID. So it was a huge public health effort that prisons never really hit the headlines in a way that other areas did.
Which, to be clear, is not what Matt Hancock recalls in his pandemic diaries, is it?
Well, I have a very clear recollection, and I have a contemporaneous note, a note that I wrote more or less at the time. And my recollection is that the emergency legislation that his department brought forward contained within it some potential draft provisions to allow for a scheme to release prisoners. It wasn't something that I'd sought or wanted. And indeed, I was very clear that I did not want those provisions. And it was only later that a very restricted scheme involving the tagging of a few hundred prisoners was cleared. And therefore, at no stage was there some secret plan by me or the MOJ to aim to release thousands of prisoners. It was something that we were very resistant to, and the events were borne out, I think, by my version of events and the work that was done by PHE, Public Health England, and by officials in my department.
Is it frustrating to read diaries of your colleagues, some of whom obviously, I mean, clearly like Matt Hancock is still in Parliament, although not for much longer, when they are suggesting things that you believe not to be true?
Yeah. Well, they're not diaries, are they? They're not contemporaneous notes, as I understand it. They're recollections that were written up by another writer well after the events. And there's always, I think, a risk with that. Look, we've got a big public inquiry started. I mean, Lady Hallett, a very experienced appeal judge, is running a major public inquiry. And I think all of us who had responsibility for major parts of public service during COVID should actually hang on and wait for that inquiry to take place. That inquiry will involve not just politicians and civil servants, but members of society, bereaved families, other interested parties who were very grievously affected by what happened. And I think we should give that inquiry the time and the respect that it deserves to make its inquiries and then make its findings. And I think it's far better to for people like me to respect that process and let that take its course before publishing or writing or disclosing recollections that we may have had about the events at the time.
Coming back to events which are now over, the events of this year, Sir Robert, you are Sir Robert now, aren't you? You've been knighted, haven't you?
Yeah, that's right, Adam. Yeah, I'm still Robert.
Yeah. Okay.
But
well, congratulations on that. Anyway,
I was knighted by the King a few weeks ago, the first man to be knighted by the King in his new role. So a particular honour for me.
Did you manage to find a Welsh angle for that?
Well, I'll say this. When I was sworn in as Secretary of State for Wales, which of course I briefly served in earlier this year, I was sworn in on a Welsh Bible and then swore my oath of allegiance to the new king in Parliament in both Welsh and English. So I have sought to reflect the pride that I have in my Welsh background in the work that I was doing as Secretary of State.
Now, you were one of those MPs who switched around your endorsements this summer during the various leadership issues. Do you have any regrets about that since we are in the confessional?
Well, actually, I don't, because the reason for my switch was a point of policy, and it's been set out, I think, quite well in Harry Cole's book. I had a big issue about the Bill of Rights that had been introduced by the then government. I thought it was a misconceived piece of work. I think it needed to be radically reformed or pulled. Liz said that she would do that. I was very keen for Rishi to follow my view and make an assurance to me that that would happen. But of course, Dominic Raab, being one of the key supporters of Rishi, and he worked very hard for him in the summer, was particularly wedded to that bill, and we had a very sharp disagreement about it. It's been chronicled elsewhere, and I felt that I couldn't work with that. I wanted that change, and that change came about when Liz became Prime Minister.
I mean, it does seem that Bill of Rights idea is on the back burner, at least reported in the Times this week.
I very much hope so. I know the Prime Minister will be looking very carefully at it and other legislation. He's wisely pulled some other bills that clearly would have taken up a lot of parliamentary time without much result. And my strong advice to him would be to pull this one. It's going to provide a lot of angst for very little result. The scope of the bill is incredibly wide. It's going to attract all sorts of Christmas tree baubles to it. The government needs this like a hole in the head at the moment. I would pull it and do something far more measured and tight as a reform of the Human Rights Act, which is what I would have done had I stayed in office as Lord Chancellor.
Do you feel regret over how that situation all played out? I mean, your personal relationships with everybody involved, Rishi Sunak, it must have been difficult.
It was very difficult. I think Rishi and I continue to have a good relationship. It wasn't easy at the time when we had that conversation, because I did have a conversation with him rather than slinking away. But I think both of us have agreed to put the matter behind us, and I'm very much keen to support him in the work that they're doing. I think that some other colleagues did feel upset by it, and it upset me too that they were saddened by it. But I think in the main, we've got through that period, and I've tried to explain as best I can the reasons why I did what I did. And if people don't wish to accept that, well, that's a matter for them. But I was clear in my conscience that what I did was right, and I didn't want to do it via the back door. I thought it was right to explain it publicly, despite some of the opprobrium I knew that I would get from some quarters.
And I mentioned at the top of this program, at the top of our chat rather, that you have done a number of different jobs in government, which also involves leaving different jobs. How do you move forward when setbacks perhaps like that happen? What's the secret, I suppose?
Well, it can be very difficult when it's unexpected. I think the most unexpected one was my departure as Lord Chancellor, which I still don't really follow to this day. I think I'm proud of the work I did. I had more fuel in the tank to get on with the reforms to human rights and constitutional law and the courts system itself that I worked in for so many years. And I just felt totally I felt as if I was in sixth gear in the fast lane, and Boris took the ignition keys away from me, and that, frankly, took me a while to adjust to. It was not easy. I decided there were two courses of action. I could have become extremely bitter and angry from the outset, or I could have do as I did, which was to withdraw for a bit, to take stock and to work out what I was there for, who I was, and what I wanted to do. And I managed to achieve that, I think. And now it's happened to me a second time. I'm even better prepared to, take on the roles that I am now doing, chairing a couple of all-party groups on autism and learning disability. I'm hopefully going to be doing a review for the government into employment opportunities for people with neurological disorders. I'm on the Northern Ireland Select Committee, pretty important committee at the moment, bearing in mind the protocol and all the issues relating to the suspension of the executive at Stormont. So I'm playing my part as a parliamentarian, and trying to find a role that means that I can make a meaningful contribution to our public life.
And with hindsight, yes or no, was it a mistake to back Liz Truss?
Look, I don't have any regrets in politics. I didn't know that she and Rishi and Kwasi were going to freelance in that way about the mini budget. Had they not done that, they might still be in office. And I think a lot of us, Sajid Javid, me, and a few others who backed Liz, were frankly surprised and shocked by that course of action. And it did mean the fall of the government.